Alice Jones was stacking boxes in a warehouse at 2 a.m. when her phone buzzed with the call that would change everything. But 12 hours earlier, her parents had made it crystal clear that college was nothing but a pipe dream for someone like her. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The fluorescent lights in the Riverside Community College computer lab flickered as Alice squinted at the calculus problem on her screen. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and she was one of only 3 students still there. The janitor had already made 2 rounds, each time giving her a knowing nod. This had become routine. Alice's day had started at 5 a.m. with her shift at Murphy's Diner, where she served coffee and eggs to truckers and early commuters. The smell of bacon grease still clung to her hair despite 2 washes. After the diner, she'd rush to her afternoon classes, then straight to her evening job at Peterson Logistics, where she spent 4 hours loading delivery trucks. Her back ached, her hands were rough from manual labor, and her bank account hovered dangerously close to zero. But none of that mattered when she was solving equations. Mathematics had always been Alice's secret language. While other kids in high school struggled with basic algebra, she was teaching herself calculus from library books. Her teachers noticed, of course. Mrs. Henderson, her senior year math teacher, had pulled her aside multiple times. "You have a gift, Alice. You should consider applying to universities with strong mathematics programs." Alice had laughed it off. Universities were for kids whose parents had college funds and stable careers. Her father, Marcus Jones, worked construction when the weather was good and unemployment when it wasn't. Her mother, Sandra, cleaned offices downtown and occasionally picked up catering gigs on weekends. They lived paycheck to paycheck in a small rental house in the industrial part of town where the windows rattled when freight trains passed. The idea of college had come up exactly once at the Jones dinner table. Alice was 16 and she'd just aced the PSAT. She'd mentioned, almost casually, that her guidance counselor said she should think about applying to 4-year schools. Marcus had set down his fork with a sharp clink. "College? Alice, honey, we can barely keep the lights on. You think we're going to send you off to some fancy school to study what? Math? What kind of job does that get you?" Sandra nodded in agreement. "Your cousin Jenny went to that technical school for medical assistants. She's making decent money now. That's realistic." "But I'm really good at math, Mom. My teachers say." "Teachers say a lot of things," Marcus interrupted. "They don't pay the bills. You're smart, Alice, but you're also practical. Community college. Get some kind of certificate, find steady work. That's how people like us get by." Alice had never brought it up again. Now, at 19, she was in her 2nd year at Riverside Community College, paying her own tuition with her 3 jobs. She'd originally enrolled for business classes, something practical, as her parents had suggested, but she'd needed a math credit, and Professor Williams had changed everything. Dr. Sarah Williams was nothing like the instructors Alice had expected at a community college. She had a PhD from Stanford and had chosen to teach at Riverside after burning out from corporate consulting. In Alice's first week of Calculus 1, Dr. Williams had handed back a test with a note scrawled in red ink, "See me after class." Alice's stomach had dropped. She'd assumed she'd failed, despite feeling confident about her answers. "I've been teaching for 15 years, Dr. Williams had said, holding up Alice's test paper. "This is the most elegant solution to problem 7 I've ever seen. Where did you learn this approach?" Alice shrugged. "I just figured it out. It seemed simpler than the textbook method." Dr. Williams had stared at her for a long moment. "Alice, have you ever considered transferring to a university?" That conversation had planted a seed that Alice tried to ignore. Universities were expensive. Universities were for other people. But Dr. Williams kept pushing, gently but persistently. "There are scholarships, Alice. Full rides for students with your ability." "I'm not scholarship material," Alice protested. "I work 3 jobs. My grades in other classes are just okay. I don't have time for extracurriculars or volunteer work or any of that stuff." "Your math grades aren't just okay. They're perfect. And you're working 3 jobs while maintaining those grades? That shows more character than any volunteer work." Dr. Williams had started staying late to give Alice additional problems, not remedial work, but advanced challenges that pushed her thinking. Topology problems, number theory, abstract algebra concepts that wouldn't normally appear in graduate school. Alice devoured them. "I have a colleague at Berkeley," Dr. Williams mentioned one evening as Alice solved a particularly complex proof. "She runs a summer research program for promising students. The application deadline isn't until March." Alice's pen stopped moving. "Dr. Williams, I can't afford." "It's paid. Full stipend, housing, everything covered. But more importantly, it would put you on the radar of mathematics departments at top universities." Alice went home that night with an application packet tucked in her backpack. She sat at her small desk in her childhood bedroom, walls still covered with faded posters from high school, and stared at the questions. Describe your research interests. Discuss a mathematical concept that excites you. What are your academic goals? Academic goals. Alice had never been allowed to have academic goals. She hid the application for 2 weeks before finally filling it out. She wrote about the beauty of mathematical proofs, about how solving complex problems felt like unlocking secrets of the universe. She described working with Dr. Williams on advanced topics and her dream of perhaps, someday, contributing to mathematical research. It felt like writing fiction. She submitted the application on a Tuesday night after her logistics shift, hitting send at 2:47 a.m. before she could lose her nerve. Then she tried to forget about it. Winter turned to spring, and Alice fell into her routine. Diner, classes, warehouse, computer lab. Her parents had stopped asking about school beyond the occasional "how's your business classes going?" She'd stopped correcting them that she was now taking advanced mathematics courses. The rejection letter would come eventually, she told herself, and that would be fine. She'd finish her associate degree, find a better job, maybe work her way up to management somewhere. It was a practical plan, a realistic plan. Dr. Williams checked in regularly about the application status, but Alice deflected. "Haven't heard anything yet," she'd say, which was technically true. It wasn't until late April that Alice realized she'd been waiting for disappointment so intently that she'd almost missed the call that would change everything. She was restocking inventory in the warehouse, her phone buried in her locker as usual during work hours. When her shift ended at midnight, she found 3 missed calls and 2 voicemails. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The first message was from an unknown California number. Alice almost deleted it without listening, probably a spam call, but something made her press play. "Hello, this is Dr. Patricia Chen from the Berkeley Mathematics Department. I'm trying to reach Alice Jones regarding her summer research application. Alice, I have some very exciting news to share with you. Please call me back at your earliest convenience, even if it's late. This is quite urgent." Alice's hands started shaking. She played the message 3 times before moving to the second voicemail. "Alice, this is Dr. Chen again. I just spoke with my colleague at Harvard, and we have a rather unusual situation. I really need to speak with you tonight if possible. This concerns not just our summer program, but potentially your entire academic future." Harvard? Alice sat in her car in the empty parking lot, phone clutched in her trembling hands. Harvard had called, about her academic future. She thought about her parents sleeping at home, about Marcus, who would be up in 5 hours for another construction job, about Sandra, who would spend tomorrow scrubbing office toilets. She thought about the warehouse she'd just left, about the diner where she'd serve coffee in 4 hours, about the practical, realistic life that had been mapped out for her. Then she thought about the equations that kept her awake at night, not because she couldn't solve them, but because she couldn't stop solving them. Alice took a deep breath and dialed the California number. Dr. Patricia Chen answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by her phone. "Alice, thank you for calling back so late. I hope you're sitting down." Alice was still in her car, warehouse uniform wrinkled and smelling of cardboard and diesel fumes. "I'm here." "Your application to our summer research program caught the attention of several faculty members. Your mathematical insights, particularly your approach to the number theory problems, were, well, extraordinary for an undergraduate student." Alice's throat felt dry. Thank you, but I'm just a community college student. I'm sure you have much more qualified. Alice, let me stop you right there. I forwarded your application to colleagues at Harvard, MIT, and Princeton. We often share exceptional candidates. What happened next was unprecedented. The parking lot was completely silent, except for the distant hum of highway traffic. Alice gripped the steering wheel with her free hand. Professor David Kellerman at Harvard called me this morning. He's the department chair, and he's been searching for a particular type of student for a special program they're launching. When he saw your work, he immediately wanted to speak with you. What kind of program? It's a full scholarship initiative for mathematically gifted students from non-traditional backgrounds. Full tuition, room and board, research stipend, everything covered. But Alice, this isn't just any scholarship. This is Harvard actively recruiting you. Alice's vision blurred. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. I don't understand. I'm nobody special. I work in a warehouse. You solved a graduate-level topology problem in 3 lines. Most PhD students need a full page. You discovered a proof technique that Professor Kellerman has only seen once before in a paper published by a Fields Medal winner. The words didn't compute. Alice knew she was good at math, but this felt like someone was describing a different person. Dr. Chen, I think there's been a mistake. I'm a community college student, working 3 jobs. I live with my parents. I've never even been on an airplane. Alice, listen to me carefully. Talent like yours appears maybe once in a decade. Professor Kellerman wants to offer you immediate admission to Harvard with a full scholarship, starting this fall, not next year, this fall. Alice sat in stunned silence. Through her windshield, she could see the warehouse where she'd just spent 4 hours moving boxes. Tomorrow, she'd be back at the diner, pouring coffee for truckers who treat her like she was invisible. I need to think about this, Alice whispered. Of course, but Alice, Professor Kellerman is flying out tomorrow to meet with you personally. This level of interest from Harvard, it's unheard of. After hanging up, Alice drove home in a daze. The familiar streets of her neighborhood looked different somehow, as if she was seeing them from a great distance. She parked in the driveway of the small rental house where she'd lived her entire life and sat staring at the chipped paint on the front door. Inside, her parents were asleep. Alice crept to her room and lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Harvard. The word felt foreign in her mind, like something from another language. She didn't sleep. At 4:30 a.m., she got up and prepared for her morning shift at Murphy's Diner. You look terrible, said Rita, the other morning waitress, as Alice tied her apron. Something like that. The morning rush passed in a blur. Alice poured coffee and took orders mechanically while her mind raced. Harvard? Wanted her? Impossible! There had to be some mistake, some mix-up with applications. During her break, she called Dr. Williams. Alice, it's barely 7 a.m. Is everything all right? Dr. Williams, did you know about this? About Harvard? A long pause. I may have made a few phone calls after you submitted your Berkeley application. I sent some of your work to former colleagues. You what? Alice, I taught at Stanford before coming here. I know exceptional talent when I see it. I wasn't going to let you languish in community college when you could be contributing to cutting-edge research. Alice felt a surge of betrayal mixed with gratitude. You should have told me. Would you have agreed? You've been programmed to think small, Alice. Your parents, your circumstances, they've taught you to accept limitations that don't apply to you. After work, Alice drove to the college to find Dr. Williams waiting in her office with a man in an expensive suit. Alice, this is Professor David Kellerman from Harvard. Professor Kellerman stood and extended his hand. He was younger than Alice had expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Miss Jones, thank you for agreeing to meet. I flew out here specifically to speak with you. Alice shook his hand, acutely aware of her diner uniform and the lingering smell of coffee. Professor, I think there's been some confusion. I'm not Harvard material. Professor Kellerman smiled. May I show you something? He opened a folder and pulled out Alice's Berkeley application. Specific problems were highlighted in yellow. This proof you submitted for the topology problem? Where did you learn this technique? I didn't learn it anywhere. I just worked through it logically. Alice, this technique was first published in 1987 by Dr. Elena Vasquez, who won the Fields Medal for her work in algebraic topology. You independently discovered her method. Alice stared at the papers. I don't know who that is. Exactly. You solved a problem using advanced techniques you invented yourself, without any formal training in the field. That's not luck, Alice. That's mathematical intuition at the highest level. Professor Kellerman leaned forward. I've been teaching mathematics for 20 years. I've worked with brilliant students, PhD candidates, and postdoctoral researchers. What you did on this application? I've seen maybe 3 other people capable of that level of insight. But I'm nobody. I work 3 jobs just to afford community college. Your background doesn't diminish your ability. It makes it more remarkable. You've developed this talent despite having no resources, no mentorship, no encouragement. Imagine what you could accomplish with proper training and support. Dr. Williams interjected quietly. Alice, what Professor Kellerman is offering you, it's a chance to contribute to mathematics in ways you've probably never imagined. The scholarship covers everything, Professor Kellerman continued. Tuition, room and board, books, research stipend. You wouldn't need to work. You could focus entirely on your studies and research. Alice felt dizzy. No more 4 a.m. shifts at the diner, no more loading trucks until midnight, no more calculating whether she could afford both textbooks and groceries. What would I study? Whatever interests you. Pure mathematics, applied mathematics, mathematical physics. You'd work directly with our research faculty on projects that push the boundaries of human knowledge. Alice thought about the equations she solved for fun, the mathematical concepts she explored in her spare time, the proofs she worked through while loading boxes in the warehouse. I need to discuss this with my parents. Professor Kellerman nodded. Of course, but Alice, I need an answer soon. The fall semester starts in 4 months, and there's significant preparation involved. That evening, Alice sat at the kitchen table with her parents over dinner. Marcus was exhausted from a long day pouring concrete. Sandra was reviewing receipts from her catering job. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something important. They looked up from their plates. I got accepted to Harvard. Marcus laughed. Harvard? Alice, come on. What's this really about? I'm serious, with a full scholarship. Everything paid for. Sandra set down her fork. Honey, is this some kind of scam? Those scholarship letters that promise free money but ask you to pay fees first? Alice pulled out the official Harvard letterhead that Professor Kellerman had left with her. Marcus took the paper and read it slowly. His expression changed from amusement to confusion to something Alice couldn't identify. This is mathematics research, he said finally. Yes. Alice, what kind of job does mathematics research get you? How do you make money with that? Dad, Harvard graduates don't struggle to find jobs. Sandra was shaking her head. This is too good to be true. There has to be a catch. What do they really want? They want me to study mathematics at the highest level, to contribute to research that advances human knowledge. Marcus stood up abruptly. Alice, listen to me. We raised you to be practical. This sounds like a fantasy. You have a good thing going at community college. Finish your business degree, get a steady job. This Harvard thing, it's not for people like us. What do you mean, people like us? Working people, real people. We don't chase pipe dreams. Alice felt something crack inside her chest. Dad, this isn't a pipe dream. They flew a professor out here just to meet me. And what happens when you can't keep up, when you realize you don't belong there? Then what? You've thrown away 2 years of practical education for nothing. Sandra reached across the table and touched Alice's hand. Honey, your father's right. This is a big risk. What if it doesn't work out? Alice looked at her parents, the people who had raised her, sacrificed for her, worked multiple jobs to keep their family afloat. They were trying to protect her from disappointment, from failure, from reaching too high and falling too hard. But they were also trying to protect her from becoming something they couldn't understand. I need some air, Alice said, standing up. She walked outside and sat on the front steps, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. Somewhere out there were galaxies and black holes and cosmic phenomena that could be described through mathematical equations. And somewhere in Massachusetts was a university where people spent their lives trying to understand those equations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Williams. Remember, Alice, your limitations are not mathematical. They're only afraid. Alice closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself walking across Harvard Yard, sitting in lecture halls, working on research that might someday matter to the world. Then she tried to imagine herself 5 years from now, still pouring coffee at Murphy's Diner, wondering what might have been. Alice didn't go to work the next morning. For the first time in 2 years, she called in sick to Murphy's Diner and drove to the public library instead. She needed to understand what she was being offered, what Harvard actually meant beyond the name everyone recognized. The library's computer section was nearly empty at 8 a.m. Alice pulled up Harvard's mathematics department website and began reading faculty profiles, research descriptions, and course offerings. The words were dense with terminology she didn't recognize, but the underlying concepts fascinated her. Professor Kellerman's bio mentioned his work in algebraic geometry and his recent paper on modular forms and elliptic curves. Alice had no idea what that meant, but she found the paper online and started reading. Most of it was incomprehensible, but she could follow the logical structure, the way one proof built upon another. She spent 3 hours researching before her phone rang. Marcus. Alice, where are you? Murphy's called looking for you. I'm at the library, Dad, researching Harvard. A long sigh. Alice, come home. We need to talk. When she arrived, both parents were waiting in the living room with serious expressions. Sandra had clearly been crying. Sit down, honey, Sandra said softly. Marcus cleared his throat. Alice, your mother and I talked all night about Harvard, about this opportunity. Alice braced herself for another lecture about being practical. We're scared, Sandra said quietly. Not of you failing. We're scared of losing you. Alice blinked in surprise. Losing me? Harvard is a different world, Marcus continued. Rich kids, professors, people who grew up with advantages we never had. What if you go there and realize you don't want to come back to this? To us? The pain in her father's voice caught Alice off guard. She'd been so focused on their opposition to her dreams that she hadn't considered their deeper fears. You think I'd abandon you? Not intentionally. But Alice, if you become this mathematician, if you live in that world, how do you come home to parents who clean toilets and pour concrete? Alice felt tears building. You're my parents. That doesn't change. Marcus leaned forward. Alice, I dropped out of high school to work construction. Your mother never went to college. We've done our best, but we don't understand this world you're entering. What if we can't relate to you anymore? What if you can't relate to us? Alice realized her parents weren't just protecting her from disappointment, they were protecting themselves from being left behind. I need you to understand something, Alice said carefully. I love mathematics because it makes sense. It's logical, predictable, but family isn't mathematical. Love isn't something you solve with equations. Sandra wiped her eyes. What if you get there and realize we're just simple people? Mom, you raised a daughter who got into Harvard. How is that simple? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. I called your supervisor at Peterson Logistics this morning. I asked him what kind of worker you are. Alice tensed. He said in 2 years, you've never missed a shift, never complained, always volunteered for extra work. He said you're the most reliable employee he's ever had. Marcus unfolded the paper. Then I called Mrs. Henderson, your high school math teacher. Still had her number from parent conferences. Asked her about this Harvard thing. Alice's stomach dropped. Dad, what did she say? She said she's been waiting 3 years for this phone call. Said she tried to convince you to apply to universities, but you always changed the subject. Marcus looked up. She said you're the most naturally gifted student she taught in 30 years. Alice stared at her father. Then I called Murphy's Diner, told them you wouldn't be coming back. Dad, Alice, we don't understand mathematics, but we understand hard work, dedication. If Harvard wants you, it's because you earned it. He stood up. We're not going to be the reason you don't go. Sandra nodded through her tears. We're proud of you, Alice. We've always been proud. We just didn't know how to show it. That afternoon, Alice called Professor Kellerman. Miss Jones, I was hoping to hear from you. Professor, I accept. She could hear his smile through the phone. Wonderful. Alice, you're making the right choice. I'll begin the paperwork immediately. What happens next? Well, first, we need to get you prepared academically. You'll be joining students who've had access to advanced placement courses, mathematical Olympiad training, summer enrichment programs. We need to bridge that gap. Alice felt a familiar surge of anxiety. How do I catch up to students who've had advantages I never had? Alice, those students learned techniques and memorized theorems. You developed mathematical intuition. That's infinitely more valuable. But you're right that there are gaps to fill. Professor Kellerman explained that Harvard would arrange for her to audit advanced courses online over the summer, and Dr. Williams had volunteered to continue working with her on advanced topics. There's something else, he continued. I'd like you to attend our summer research program at Berkeley first. Dr. Chen specifically requested you for her topology project. Alice's head spun. Berkeley, then Harvard. 6 months ago, she'd never imagined leaving her hometown. Professor, I have to ask, are you sure I belong there? I mean, really sure? Alice, let me tell you about my first day at MIT as a graduate student. I sat in advanced topology surrounded by students from elite universities. The professor wrote a problem on the board that had stumped researchers for months. I was terrified to even attempt it. What happened? A first-year student solved it in 20 minutes. Not someone from Harvard or Princeton, a kid from a community college in rural Montana who taught himself mathematics from library books. Talent doesn't care about your zip code, Alice. That evening, Alice began the process of preparing for a life she'd never dared imagine. She researched Berkeley, studied campus maps, and read about the professors she'd work with. The logistics felt overwhelming: flights, housing, course schedules, research projects. But the mathematics excited her in ways she couldn't explain. She'd always solved problems for the pure joy of finding solutions. Now she'd be working on problems that no one had solved before, contributing to human knowledge in ways that might matter for decades. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. Alice gave notice at her remaining jobs, though Peterson Logistics offered to hold her position in case she wanted to return for Christmas break. "We're gonna miss you, kiddo," her supervisor said, "but honestly, I always knew you were too smart for warehouse work." Dr. Williams met with Alice 3 times a week, introducing her to advanced concepts she'd encountered at Berkeley. Number theory, abstract algebra, real analysis, fields of mathematics Alice had only glimpsed before. "You're learning at an extraordinary pace," Dr. Williams observed during one session. "Most students need months to grasp these concepts. You're integrating them in days." Alice's parents watched her transformation with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Sandra bought her a set of expensive luggage for Berkeley, the first new suitcases anyone in the family had ever owned. Marcus researched Boston weather and insisted on buying her a proper winter coat, even though she wouldn't need it for months. The night before her flight to California, Alice couldn't sleep. She walked through the house she'd lived in her entire life, touching familiar objects, memorizing details she'd always taken for granted. Her childhood bedroom with its narrow bed and hand-me-down furniture, the kitchen table where she'd done homework for 12 years, the front steps where she'd sat contemplating her impossible future just weeks before. At 3 a.m., she found her parents sitting at the kitchen table with cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep either," Sandra said. They sat together in comfortable silence until sunrise. 3 people on the edge of a transformation none of them fully understood. Marcus finally spoke. "Alice, we don't know what's coming next. We don't know how to help you in this new world, but we know who you are, and that's never going to change." "Promise us something," Sandra added. "Promise you'll remember where you came from. Not because you should be ashamed of it, but because it's part of your strength." Alice looked at her parents, people who'd worked multiple jobs to keep their family afloat, who'd sacrificed their own dreams to support hers, who were now encouraging her to fly further than they'd ever imagined possible. "I promise," she whispered. At 6 a.m., they loaded her luggage into Marcus's pickup truck and drove to the airport. Alice Jones, who had never been on an airplane, was about to embark on a journey that would take her from warehouse worker to Harvard mathematician. But first, she had to survive Berkeley. The Berkeley campus overwhelmed Alice before she even found her dormitory. Students moved with confident purpose across manicured lawns, speaking casually about research projects and graduate school applications. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Alice dragged her suitcase up 3 flights of stairs to her assigned room in the mathematics program housing. Her roommate had already arrived, Rebecca Chen, a junior from UCLA with perfectly organized study materials and a wall covered in mathematics conference posters. "You must be Alice from the community college," Rebecca said without looking up from her textbook. "Dr. Chen mentioned you'd be joining us." Alice detected something dismissive in her tone. "That's me." "Interesting that they're letting undergraduates into the topology research group. Usually that's reserved for graduate students." Alice unpacked her few belongings while Rebecca continued reading. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Rebecca finally asked, "What's your background in abstract mathematics?" "I'm not sure what you mean." Rebecca closed her book and turned around. "Real analysis, complex analysis, abstract algebra, differential geometry?"
Alice felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I've done some work with Dr. Williams on advanced topics, but mostly self-taught." "Self-taught?" Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "This program assumes familiarity with graduate-level concepts. We'll be working on research problems that require years of foundational knowledge." That night, Alice lay awake wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. She'd been so focused on proving herself worthy of Harvard that she hadn't considered whether she could survive even the preliminary step at Berkeley. The next morning brought their first research group meeting. Dr. Patricia Chen welcomed 12 students into a conference room overlooking the San Francisco Bay. "This summer, we'll be investigating open problems in algebraic topology, specifically focusing on homotopy theory applications in knot invariants." Alice understood perhaps half the words. Around the table, other students nodded knowingly and asked sophisticated questions about methodology and existing literature. Dr. Chen distributed research assignments. "Alice, I'd like you to work with Team 3 on the fundamental group calculations. Rebecca will be your team leader." Rebecca shot Alice a look that clearly said she'd rather work alone. The first week was brutal. Alice spent hours each night in the library, racing to understand concepts her teammates had learned years earlier. Fundamental groups, covering spaces, homomorphisms, the terminology alone was daunting. But something strange began happening. While Alice struggled with the formal definitions, she started seeing patterns the others missed. During their third team meeting, Rebecca was explaining why a particular approach wouldn't work. "The computational complexity makes it impossible," Rebecca concluded. "Dr. Vasquez's 1987 paper proved this method hits a dead end." Alice had been quietly working through the problem on scratch paper. "What if we approach it from the other direction?" "Excuse me?" Alice showed her calculations. "Instead of trying to compute the fundamental group directly, we could use the covering space properties to establish the relationship first, then work backwards." Rebecca studied Alice's work, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching respect. This might actually work. "But Alice, this technique isn't in any textbook I know." "I just thought about what the problem was really asking and worked logically from there." Rebecca stared at the equations. "You independently derived a variation of the Seifert-Van Kampen theorem? Do you realize that?" Alice didn't realize it, but she was beginning to understand that her mathematical intuition operated differently from her classmates' formal training. Word of Alice's breakthrough reached Dr. Chen, who requested a private meeting. "Alice, your team's progress this week has been remarkable. Rebecca tells me you've developed an innovative approach to a problem we've been stuck on for months." I just tried to think about it differently. That's exactly what mathematical research is, thinking about problems differently. Your teammates have extensive formal training, but you bring something equally valuable, fresh perspective, unencumbered by conventional assumptions. But I'm so far behind everyone else in basic knowledge. Alice, let me share something. Last year, I had a graduate student from Harvard who knew every theorem in algebraic topology. Brilliant student, perfect grades, impeccable credentials. He spent the entire summer working on a problem and made zero progress because he couldn't think beyond established methods. Dr. Chen leaned forward. You've been here 1 week and already contributed more original thinking than most students do in a full semester. Your gaps in formal knowledge are fixable. Your mathematical creativity is irreplaceable. As the weeks progressed, Alice found her rhythm. She supplemented her research work with intensive self-study, often staying up until 2 a.m., mastering concepts she needed for the next day's work. Her teammates began seeking her input on problems, not despite her unconventional background, but because of it. Rebecca, initially cold and competitive, became an unexpected ally. One evening, she found Alice in the library, surrounded by topology textbooks. You know, when I first heard about you, I thought it was some diversity initiative. Community college, working class background. I figured they were lowering standards. Alice looked up from her notes. I was wrong. You're not here because of your background. You're here despite it. What you've accomplished with essentially no formal training, it's actually kind of terrifying. Terrifying? Alice, I've been studying mathematics since middle school. Math camps, competitions, elite prep courses. I know all the theorems, all the techniques, but when you look at a problem, you see something I don't, something I was never taught to see. I'm gonna be honest, you make me question whether all my advantages actually matter. Alice realized that her classmates' confidence masked their own insecurities. They'd been trained to solve known problems using established methods, but research required creating new methods for unsolved problems. Midway through the program, Dr. Chen assigned a particularly challenging project. I want each team to tackle an open problem in topology, something without a known solution. Your goal isn't necessarily to solve it, but to make meaningful progress. Alice's T was assigned a problem involving the classification of certain three-dimensional manifolds. Alice spent 2 days reading background papers before she even understood what the problem was asking.
On the third day, while her teammates debated sophisticated theoretical approaches, Alice started doodling on scratch paper. She drew simple diagrams, trying to visualize the three-dimensional structures they were studying. "Alice, what are you doing?" Rebecca asked. "Just trying to see the problem." Alice's sketches were crude, but they revealed something the formal equations obscured. She saw a pattern in how the manifolds related to each other, a symmetry that suggested a different classification approach. "What if these aren't separate cases?" Alice said suddenly. "What if they're all variations of the same underlying structure?" The team spent the next week developing Alice's insight. Her intuitive understanding, combined with her teammates' technical knowledge, produced results that surprised even Dr. Chen. "This is graduate-level work," Dr. Chen told Alice privately. "Actually, it's beyond that. You've identified a connection that could reshape how we think about manifold classification." Alice's confidence grew, but so did her awareness of how much she still didn't know. Her successes at Berkeley were built on mathematical intuition, but Harvard would demand both intuition and encyclopedic knowledge. 2 weeks before the program ended, Professor Kellerman called. "Alice, Dr. Chen has been updating me on your progress. She's quite impressed." "I'm learning a lot, but I'm also realizing how much I don't know." That's exactly the right attitude. "Alice, I want to discuss your transition to Harvard. We've arranged for you to spend August working with one of our graduate students, someone who can help bridge the gap between your current knowledge and what you'll need for our undergraduate program." Graduate student mentor? Jessica Rodriguez. She grew up in East Los Angeles, first in her family to attend college. She understands the cultural adjustment as well as the academic one. Alice felt a wave of relief. She wouldn't be navigating Harvard entirely alone. Professor Kellerman, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Do you think I can actually succeed at Harvard? Not just survive, but really succeed? Professor Kellerman was quiet for a moment. Alice, Dr. Chen sent me your work from this summer. Your approach to the manifold classification problem, it's the kind of thinking that produces doctoral dissertations. You're not just Harvard material, you're future research faculty material. After the call, Alice sat on her dormitory bed and tried to process everything. 8 weeks ago, she'd been loading trucks in a warehouse. Now, professors at elite universities were discussing her potential for advanced research. Berkeley had taught her that mathematical talent could overcome gaps in formal training. But more importantly, it had taught her that she belonged in academic mathematics, not despite her background, but because her unique perspective contributed something valuable. The night before leaving Berkeley, Alice's research team gathered for a farewell dinner. Rebecca raised her glass of water in a toast. To Alice, who taught us that sometimes the best mathematical education isn't found in classrooms. Alice looked around the table at students from UCLA, Stanford, MIT, peers she'd somehow found among the most elite mathematical minds of her generation. Tomorrow, she'd fly to Boston to begin preparing for Harvard. Tonight, for the first time in her life, Alice Jones felt like she might actually belong wherever mathematics could take her. Harvard Yard in August felt like stepping into a postcard. Ancient brick buildings, perfectly maintained lawns, and students who moved with the casual confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to be there. Alice wheeled her suitcase across the cobblestones, following the directions to Wigglesworth Hall, where she'd spent her freshman year. Her room was a narrow single on the third floor, with tall windows overlooking the courtyard. Alice unpacked her belongings, still fitting everything into 2 suitcases, and tried to ignore the voices in the hallway discussing family vacations to Europe and prep school reunions. A knock on her door interrupted her organizing. A young woman with short black hair and kind eyes stood in the hallway. "You must be Alice. I'm Jessica Rodriguez, your graduate student mentor." Alice had spoken with Jessica on the phone, but meeting in person felt different. Jessica was probably only 4 years older, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who belonged in Harvard's mathematics department. "How are you feeling about starting here?" Jessica asked, settling into Alice's desk chair. "Terrified," Alice admitted. Jessica laughed. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. I was terrified my entire first year. The difference is, you've already proven you can handle being the outsider." "What do you mean?" "Alice, you succeeded at Berkeley surrounded by students with years of advanced training. Harvard undergraduates will be challenging, but you've already faced a bigger adjustment than anything you'll encounter here." Jessica explained the academic landscape Alice was entering. Harvard's mathematics program was small, selective, and intense. Most students arrive with extensive competition mathematics backgrounds, summer research experience, and family connections to academic life. "But here's what they don't have," Jessica continued. "They don't have your perspective. They've been trained to think inside established frameworks. You've learned to think outside them." Over the next 2 weeks, Jessica helped Alice navigate both the academic and social terrain. They reviewed the syllabi for Alice's fall courses: multivariable calculus, linear algebra, introduction to proofs, and differential equations. "These courses will feel basic compared to your Berkeley research," Jessica warned. "Don't let that make you complacent. Harvard expects perfection in fundamentals." Alice's first real test came during freshman orientation week. She attended a mathematics department meet and greet, where undergraduates gathered with faculty and graduate students. The conversation swirled around mathematical Olympiads, prestigious summer programs, and research publications. "I'm David Chen," said a fellow freshman, extending his hand. "You?" Alice hesitated. "Alice Jones. I just transferred from community college." David's expression shifted slightly. "Oh, community college. That's different. What competitions did you do there?" "I didn't do competitions. I worked." An awkward silence stretched between them before David excused himself to join another conversation. Alice was considering leaving when Professor Kellerman appeared beside her. How are you adjusting, Alice? I'm not sure I fit in here. Professor Kellerman glanced around the room. See that student over there discussing his Intel Science Fair project? Brilliant kid. Excellent technical skills. But last week, I gave him a research problem that required creative thinking. He's been stuck for 6 days because he can't see beyond conventional approaches. Alice followed his gaze to a confident-looking student surrounded by an admiring circle. Alice, these students have impressive credentials, but credentials aren't the same as mathematical insight. You've already demonstrated insight that many of them may never develop. Classes began the following week. Alice's professors were world-renowned mathematicians who treated undergraduate courses as opportunities to introduce students to the beauty and rigor of advanced mathematics. Professor Margaret Sullivan, who taught Alice's proofs course, had a reputation for intellectual intimidation. On the first day, she surveyed the classroom of 20 students. Mathematics is not a collection of formulas to memorize, Professor Sullivan began. It's a language for describing truth. This semester, you'll learn to speak that language fluently. She wrote a simple-looking statement on the board. Prove that the square root of 2 is irrational. Standard proof by contradiction, whispered a student behind Alice. Alice raised her hand. Could I show a different approach? Professor Sullivan's eyebrows rose. Please. Alice walked to the board and began writing. Instead of the classic contradiction proof, she demonstrated an approach using continued fractions that revealed deeper properties of irrational numbers. The classroom fell silent. Professor Sullivan studied Alice's work carefully. Ms. Jones, where did you learn this technique? I worked it out myself a few years ago when I was curious about irrational numbers. This is a graduate-level approach. You independently discovered a proof technique that appears in advanced number theory courses. Alice returned to her seat, aware that every student was staring at her. After class, several classmates approached with questions, but their tone had changed from dismissive to curious. Alice, right? Said a student named Michael Park. That proof was incredible. Are you on the honors track? I don't think so. I'm just taking regular courses. You should talk to Professor Sullivan about advanced placement. That level of thinking, you're probably ready for graduate courses already. Alice's reputation spread quickly through Harvard's small mathematics community. Professors began mentioning her in faculty meetings, and graduate students started seeking her input on problems. But the social adjustment remained challenging. Alice's classmates were brilliant and accomplished, but their conversations often centered around experiences she couldn't relate to. Private tutors, family trips to mathematical conferences, parents who were professors or researchers. The financial contrast was stark too. While Alice's scholarship covered everything necessary, she watched classmates spend casually on dinners, textbooks, and weekend trips that cost more than her family's monthly grocery budget. 3 weeks into the semester, Alice called home from her dorm room. "How's Harvard, sweetheart?" Sandra asked. "Academically, it's going well. But Mom, I feel like I'm living in a different world. These kids, they're so different from anyone I've ever known." Different how? They've never worried about money. They've never worked jobs. They talk about mathematical concepts like they're discussing the weather. I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. Marcus took the phone. Alice, listen to me. You earned your place there. You didn't pretend your way in. You proved your way in. But Dad, sometimes I wonder if I should have just stayed at community college, finished my degree, gotten a normal job. Alice, do you still love mathematics? More than ever. The problems here are incredible, and the professors, they're the smartest people I've ever met. Then you're where you belong. The rest is just noise. Alice's breakthrough came during a particularly challenging problem set in Professor Sullivan's class. The final question asked students to construct an original proof for a theorem about prime numbers. Most students submitted variations of proofs they'd found in textbooks or online resources. Alice spent 3 days developing an entirely novel approach that connected number theory to topology in ways she'd learned at Berkeley. Professor Sullivan requested a meeting the following week. Alice, your proof was extraordinary. Not just correct, but genuinely innovative. I showed it to several colleagues, and they agree it demonstrates graduate-level mathematical maturity. Alice felt a familiar surge of disbelief. Thank you, but I'm sure other students. Alice, let me be direct. In 20 years of teaching, I've encountered perhaps 5 undergraduates with your level of mathematical creativity. You need to start thinking seriously about advanced coursework and research opportunities. Professor Sullivan, I still feel like I'm catching up to my classmates in basic knowledge. Your classmates have more exposure to standard techniques, but mathematical research isn't about memorizing techniques, it's about discovering new ones. Your Berkeley work already demonstrated that. Professor Sullivan leaned forward. Alice, I want to nominate you for our summer undergraduate research program. It's highly competitive, but based on your work so far, I believe you'd be accepted. What kind of research? You'd work directly with faculty on unsolved problems. Last year's participants included several students who later earned prestigious graduate fellowships. It's exactly the kind of experience that prepares students for doctoral programs at top universities. Alice's head spun. Doctoral programs. 6 months ago, she'd been worried about affording textbooks for community college. Professor Sullivan, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Do you think someone like me, someone from my background, can really succeed in academic mathematics long term? Professor Sullivan was quiet for a moment. Alice, mathematical ability has nothing to do with background. Some of history's greatest mathematicians came from humble circumstances. Ramanujan was a clerk in India. Cantor faced discrimination his entire career. What matters isn't where you started, it's how deeply you can think. She paused. But I'll tell you what does matter about your background. You've learned to work harder than your peers, to value opportunities others take for granted, and to think independently because no one handed you ready-made solutions. Those aren't disadvantages, Alice. They're competitive advantages. Walking back to her dorm, Alice reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. A year ago, her biggest concern was whether she could afford both gas and groceries. Now professors at Harvard were discussing her potential for mathematical research careers. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand that her journey to Harvard hadn't been about escaping her background. It had been about discovering how her background could contribute to mathematics in ways no one else could replicate. That evening, Alice called Jessica with news about the research opportunity. Alice, that's incredible. Professor Sullivan doesn't make recommendations lightly. Jessica, do you think I'm ready for this level of responsibility? Alice, you've been ready since Berkeley. The question isn't whether you can handle advanced research, it's whether you're ready to accept that you belong at the highest levels of mathematics. Alice looked out her dorm window at Harvard Yard, where students moved purposefully between classes and study groups. For the first time since arriving, she felt like she might be one of them, not because she'd learned to fit in, but because she'd learned to stand out for all the right reasons. The Harvard Mathematics Department holiday party was held in the faculty lounge, a wood-paneled room lined with portraits of legendary mathematicians. Alice stood near the refreshment table, watching professors and graduate students discuss research over wine and cheese, when Professor Kellerman approached an elderly man she didn't recognize. Alice, I'd like you to meet Professor Emeritus Robert Whitman. He's been following your progress with great interest. Professor Whitman extended a weathered hand. Miss Jones, David has shown me several of your proofs. Quite remarkable work for a first-year student. Thank you, sir. I understand you're considering our summer research program. Have you given thought to what area you'd like to explore? Alice hesitated. I'm interested in the intersection of topology and number theory, but I'm not sure if that's a viable research direction. Professor Whitman's eyes lit up. Not viable? My dear, that's one of the most exciting frontiers in modern mathematics. The connections between topological invariance and arithmetic properties. There's groundbreaking work waiting to be done. He leaned closer conspiratorially. In fact, I've been hoping to find an undergraduate capable of tackling some preliminary investigations in that area. Would you be interested in working with me? Alice's wine glass nearly slipped from her hands. Professor Whitman was a legend in the field. author of textbooks she'd studied, recipient of numerous international awards. Professor Whitman, I'm honored, but I'm just a freshman. Surely you'd prefer someone with more experience. Experience is overrated. A fresh perspective is invaluable. Your Berkeley work demonstrated exactly the kind of unconventional thinking this research requires. The following week, Alice met with Professor Whitman in his office, a cluttered sanctuary filled with mathematical journals dating back decades and blackboards covered in half-erased equations. Alice, I want to show you something that's been puzzling me for months, he said, pointing to a complex diagram on his whiteboard. This is a representation of certain three-dimensional knot invariants that seem to correspond to patterns in prime number distribution. Alice studied the diagram, her mind racing to understand the connections he was suggesting. The correlation appears too strong to be coincidental, Professor Whitman continued, but no one has been able to prove a direct relationship. Traditional approaches have failed because they treat topology and number theory as separate domains. What if they're not separate? Alice said suddenly. Exactly, but proving that connection requires developing entirely new mathematical frameworks. That's where you come in. Alice's wine glass nearly slipped from her hands. Professor Whitman was a legend in the field, author of textbooks she'd studied, recipient of numerous international awards. Professor Whitman, I'm honored, but I'm just a freshman. Surely you'd prefer someone with more experience. Experience is overrated. A fresh perspective is invaluable. Your Berkeley work demonstrated exactly the kind of unconventional thinking this research requires. The following week, Alice met with Professor Whitman in his office, a cluttered sanctuary filled with mathematical journals dating back decades and blackboards covered in half-erased equations. Alice, I want to show you something that's been puzzling me for months, he said, pointing to a complex diagram on his whiteboard. This is a representation of certain three-dimensional knot invariants that seem to correspond to patterns in prime number distribution. Alice studied the diagram, her mind racing to understand the connections he was suggesting. The correlation appears too strong to be coincidental, Professor Whitman continued, but no one has been able to prove a direct relationship. Traditional approaches have failed because they treat topology and number theory as separate domains. What if they're not separate? Alice said suddenly. Exactly, but proving that connection requires developing entirely new mathematical frameworks. That's where you come in. Alice spent the next several weeks immersed in background reading, trying to understand the current state of research at the intersection of her interests. The mathematics was challenging, but the underlying questions fascinated her. Meanwhile, her regular coursework continued to distinguish her among her peers. In linear algebra, Professor Williams assigned a final project requiring students to explore applications of linear transformations in their chosen field. Most students selected standard applications: computer graphics, optimization problems, statistical analysis. Alice chose to investigate how linear algebra could illuminate the structure of mathematical proofs themselves. Her presentation drew a standing ovation from her classmates and prompted Professor Williams to invite her to present her findings at the department's undergraduate research symposium. Alice, this work is publishable, Professor Williams told her after class. You've identified connections that professional researchers haven't noticed. We should consider submitting this to the Undergraduate Mathematics Journal. The research symposium was Alice's first experience presenting mathematical work to a formal academic audience. As she explained her findings to a room filled with faculty and graduate students, she felt a transformation occurring within herself. She was no longer the uncertain community college transfer student trying to prove she belonged. She was a mathematician presenting original research to her peers. Dr. Chen, visiting from Berkeley for the symposium, approached Alice afterward. Alice, I'm not surprised to see you thriving here, but I am impressed by how quickly you've established yourself as a serious researcher. Professor Whitman tells me you're working on some fascinating problems with him. It's challenging work, but incredibly exciting. I feel like I'm finally understanding what mathematical research actually involves. How are you finding social adjustment? I know Harvard can be an intimidating environment. Alice considered the question carefully. It was difficult at first. I felt like everyone else had advantages I'd never had, but I'm learning that different backgrounds create different strengths. Dr. Chen smiled. That's a mature perspective. It took me years to reach that understanding. Spring semester brought Alice's first graduate-level course. Professor Kellerman had recommended her for advanced number theory, typically reserved for seniors and graduate students. On the first day, Alice found herself in a seminar room with 12 other students, most of them in their final year of undergraduate study or beginning graduate work. Professor Elena Vasquez, the same mathematician whose work Alice had unknowingly replicated years earlier, taught the course with an intensity that challenged even the most prepared students. This semester, we'll explore the frontiers of algebraic number theory, Professor Vasquez announced. Each of you will contribute original research that advances our understanding of open problems in the field. Alice felt the familiar surge of anxiety. Original research that advances understanding? She was still learning the basic terminology. But as the weeks progressed, Alice discovered that her unconventional background actually helped her approach problems differently. While her classmates relied on established techniques, Alice developed novel approaches that often proved more elegant. During one particularly challenging problem set, Alice devised a solution that shocked Professor Vasquez. Alice, could you explain how you arrived at this approach? Alice walked through her reasoning, showing how she'd connected concepts from topology, analysis, and number theory in ways that weren't covered in any textbook. This technique, it's similar to work I published 15 years ago, but your application is more sophisticated. Where did you learn this? I didn't learn it anywhere, Professor. I just worked through the logic until I found a path that made sense. Professor Vasquez stared at Alice's solution for a long moment. Alice, you've just solved a problem I've been working on intermittently for months, and your method opens up possibilities for related problems that I hadn't considered. After class, several graduate students approached Alice with questions about her technique. For the first time since arriving at Harvard, Alice felt like her peers were seeking her expertise rather than questioning her qualifications. The spring undergraduate research presentations showcased Alice's work with Professor Whitman on topology and number theory connections. Their preliminary findings suggested that certain topological invariants could predict properties of prime number sequences with unprecedented accuracy. The mathematics department faculty attended en masse, recognizing the potential significance of the research. During the question and answer session, Professor Margaret Sullivan raised her hand. Alice, this work has implications for several major conjectures in number theory. Have you considered pursuing doctoral studies in this area? Alice felt her cheeks flush. I haven't really thought that far ahead, Professor Sullivan. Perhaps you should. Research of this caliber suggests you have the potential for significant contributions to the field. After the presentation, Alice was surrounded by faculty members offering encouragement and advice about graduate school. The same professors who had seemed intimidatingly brilliant just months earlier were now treating her as a promising colleague. Professor Kellerman pulled her aside as the crowd dispersed. Alice, I want to discuss your future plans. Based on your work this year, you're ready for accelerated advancement. We could arrange for you to complete your undergraduate degree in 3 years and begin graduate coursework immediately. Graduate school? Already? Alice, you're already doing graduate-level research. The question isn't whether you're ready for advanced study, it's whether you're ready to accept that mathematics is your calling. That evening, Alice walked across Harvard Yard toward her dormitory, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Doctoral programs, research careers, contributions to mathematical knowledge that might outlast her lifetime. She called home from her room, needing to share the day's events with the people who had made it all possible. Mom, they think I should apply for graduate school. Already? Honey, you've only been there 8 months. They think I'm ready. Professor Kellerman says I could finish my undergraduate degree early and start advanced research. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Alice, are you happy? Really happy? Alice looked around her dorm room, at the mathematical journals scattered across her desk, at the whiteboard covered with equations from her latest research project. Mom, I've never been happier. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Then that's all that matters to your father and me. We're proud of you, sweetheart. We always knew you were special, even when we didn't understand what that meant.
After hanging up, Alice sat at her desk and began working on her latest research problem. Outside her window, Harvard Yard was quiet in the evening darkness, but inside her room, Alice Jones was discovering that mathematics could take her further than she'd ever dreamed possible. The girl who'd loaded trucks in a warehouse just 2 years earlier was now being courted by graduate programs at the world's most prestigious universities. But more importantly, she was finally beginning to understand that her journey hadn't been about overcoming her background. It had been about discovering how that background could contribute something unique to the world of mathematics. The Harvard Mathematics Department holiday party was held in the faculty lounge, a wood-paneled room lined with portraits of legendary mathematicians. Alice stood near the refreshment table, watching professors and graduate students discuss research over wine and cheese, when Professor Kellerman approached an elderly man she didn't recognize. "Alice, I'd like you to meet Professor Emeritus Robert Whitman. He's been following your progress with great interest." Professor Whitman extended a weathered hand. "Ms. Jones, David has shown me several of your proofs. Quite remarkable work for a first-year student." "Thank you, sir. I understand you're considering our summer research program. Have you given thought to what area you'd like to explore?" Alice hesitated. "I'm interested in the intersection of topology and number theory, but I'm not sure if that's a viable research direction." Professor Whitman's eyes lit up. "Not viable? My dear, that's one of the most exciting frontiers in modern mathematics. The connections between topological invariance and arithmetic properties, there's groundbreaking work waiting to be done." He leaned closer conspiratorially. "In fact, I've been hoping to find an undergraduate capable of tackling some preliminary investigations in that area. Would you be interested in working with me?" Alice's wine glass nearly slipped from her hands. Professor Whitman was a legend in the field, author of textbooks she'd studied, recipient of numerous international awards. "Professor Whitman, I'm honored, but I'm just a freshman. Surely you'd prefer someone with more experience." "Experience is overrated. A fresh perspective is invaluable. Your Berkeley work demonstrated exactly the kind of unconventional thinking this research requires." The following week, Alice met with Professor Whitman in his office, a cluttered sanctuary filled with mathematical journals dating back decades and blackboards covered in half-erased equations. "Alice, I want to show you something that's been puzzling me for months," he said, pointing to a complex diagram on his whiteboard. "This is a representation of certain three-dimensional knot invariants that seem to correspond to patterns in prime number distribution." Alice studied the diagram, her mind racing to understand the connections he was suggesting. "The correlation appears too strong to be coincidental," Professor Whitman continued, "but no one has been able to prove a direct relationship. Traditional approaches have failed because they treat topology and number theory as separate domains." "What if they're not separate?" Alice said suddenly. "Exactly. But proving that connection requires developing entirely new mathematical frameworks. That's where you come in." Alice spent the next several weeks immersed in background reading, trying to understand the current state of research at the intersection of her interests. The mathematics was challenging, but the underlying questions fascinated her. Meanwhile, her regular coursework continued to distinguish her among her peers. In linear algebra, Professor Williams assigned a final project requiring students to explore applications of linear transformations in their chosen field. Most students selected standard applications: computer graphics, optimization problems, statistical analysis. Alice chose to investigate how linear algebra could illuminate the structure of mathematical proofs themselves. Her presentation drew a standing ovation from her classmates and prompted Professor Williams to invite her to present her findings at the department's undergraduate research symposium. "Alice, this work is publishable," Professor Williams told her after class. "You've identified connections that professional researchers haven't noticed. We should consider submitting this to the Undergraduate Mathematics Journal."
The research symposium was Alice's first experience presenting mathematical work to a formal academic audience. As she explained her findings to a room filled with faculty and graduate students, she felt a transformation occurring within herself. She was no longer the uncertain community college transfer student trying to prove she belonged. She was a mathematician presenting original research to her peers. Dr. Chen, visiting from Berkeley for the symposium, approached Alice afterward. Alice, I'm not surprised to see you thriving here, but I am impressed by how quickly you've established yourself as a serious researcher. Professor Whitman tells me you're working on some fascinating problems with him. It's challenging work, but incredibly exciting. I feel like I'm finally understanding what mathematical research actually involves. How are you finding social adjustment? I know Harvard can be an intimidating environment. Alice considered the question carefully. It was difficult at first. I felt like everyone else had advantages I'd never had, but I'm learning that different backgrounds create different strengths. Dr. Chen smiled. That's a mature perspective. It took me years to reach that understanding. Spring semester brought Alice's first graduate-level course. Professor Kellerman had recommended her for advanced number theory, typically reserved for seniors and graduate students. On the first day, Alice found herself in a seminar room with 12 other students, most of them in their final year of undergraduate study or beginning graduate work. Professor Elena Vasquez, the same mathematician whose work Alice had unknowingly replicated years earlier, taught the course with an intensity that challenged even the most prepared students. This semester, we'll explore the frontiers of algebraic number theory, Professor Vasquez announced. Each of you will contribute original research that advances our understanding of open problems in the field. Alice felt the familiar surge of anxiety. Original research that advances understanding? She was still learning the basic terminology. But as the weeks progressed, Alice discovered that her unconventional background actually helped her approach problems differently. While her classmates relied on established techniques, Alice developed novel approaches that often proved more elegant. During one particularly challenging problem set, Alice devised a solution that shocked Professor Vasquez. Alice, could you explain how you arrived at this approach? Alice walked through her reasoning, showing how she'd connected concepts from topology, analysis, and number theory in ways that weren't covered in any textbook. This technique, it's similar to work I published 15 years ago, but your application is more sophisticated. Where did you learn this?
I didn't learn it anywhere, Professor. I just worked through the logic until I found a path that made sense. Professor Vasquez stared at Alice's solution for a long moment. Alice, you've just solved a problem I've been working on intermittently for months, and your method opens up possibilities for related problems that I hadn't considered. After class, several graduate students approached Alice with questions about her technique. For the first time since arriving at Harvard, Alice felt like her peers were seeking her expertise rather than questioning her qualifications. The spring undergraduate research presentations showcased Alice's work with Professor Whitman on topology and number theory connections. Their preliminary findings suggested that certain topological invariants could predict properties of prime number sequences with unprecedented accuracy. The mathematics department faculty attended en masse, recognizing the potential significance of the research. During the question and answer session, Professor Margaret Sullivan raised her hand. Alice, this work has implications for several major conjectures in number theory. Have you considered pursuing doctoral studies in this area? Alice felt her cheeks flush. I haven't really thought that far ahead, Professor Sullivan. Perhaps you should. Research of this caliber suggests you have the potential for significant contributions to the field. After the presentation, Alice was surrounded by faculty members offering encouragement and advice about graduate school. The same professors who had seemed intimidatingly brilliant just months earlier were now treating her as a promising colleague. Professor Kellerman pulled her aside as the crowd dispersed. Alice, I want to discuss your future plans. Based on your work this year, you're ready for accelerated advancement. We could arrange for you to complete your undergraduate degree in 3 years and begin graduate coursework immediately. Graduate school? Already?
Alice, you're already doing graduate level research. The question isn't whether you're ready for advanced study, it's whether you're ready to accept that mathematics is your calling. That evening, Alice walked across Harvard Yard toward her dormitory, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Doctoral programs, research careers, contributions to mathematical knowledge that might outlast her lifetime. She called home from her room, needing to share the day's events with the people who had made it all possible. Mom, they think I should apply for graduate school. Already? Honey, you've only been there 8 months. They think I'm ready. Professor Kellerman says I could finish my undergraduate degree early and start advanced research. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Alice, are you happy? Really happy? Alice looked around her dorm room, at the mathematical journals scattered across her desk, at the whiteboard covered with equations from her latest research project. Mom, I've never been happier. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Then that's all that matters to your father and me. We're proud of you, sweetheart. We always knew you were special, even when we didn't understand what that meant. After hanging up, Alice sat at her desk and began working on her latest research problem. Outside her window, Harvard Yard was quiet in the evening darkness, but inside her room, Alice Jones was discovering that mathematics could take her further than she'd ever dreamed possible. The girl who'd loaded trucks in a warehouse just 2 years earlier was now being courted by graduate programs at the world's most prestigious universities. But more importantly, she was finally beginning to understand that her journey hadn't been about overcoming her background. It had been about discovering how that background could contribute something unique to the world of mathematics. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.